Zenithar Academy stood as a monolithic beacon of knowledge, its spires stretching into the stars, a testament to the unity of the galactic civilizations that had come together to foster the greatest minds of 1,000 worlds. It was an institution that had existed long before humanity had even grasped the basics of space travel, a place where intellect, innovation, and discipline were honed to perfection. For Eli Carter, it was a dream come true. Stepping off the transport shuttle, he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 1,000,000 stars above him. Around him, towering alien students moved with effortless grace, their complex languages humming in the air like a chorus of wisdom beyond his understanding. He saw the crystalline forms of the Orcs shimmering under artificial suns, the multi-limbed core weaving their holographic displays mid-air, and the Talnax, whose eerie, pupil-less eyes glowed softly as they communicated telepathically. And then there was him, just a human. Eli wasn't foolish. He knew what he looked like to them. Small, fragile, insignificant. The galactic community often referred to humans as soft-bodied primitives, a species barely beyond their homeworld. The fact that the Academy had even accepted him had been a shock to many. Some saw it as an amusing experiment. Others, an outright mistake. But he wasn't here to be pitted. Eli clenched his fists, determination burning in his chest. He wasn't the strongest, nor the fastest. He didn't have telepathic abilities or advanced cybernetic enhancements. What he did have was something no alien could measure: resilience, adaptability, and the stubborn refusal to quit. Still, as he walked through the grand entrance of the Academy, doubts clawed at the edges of his mind. Would he really be able to keep up? The first few weeks were grueling. Every lesson, every challenge, every test was like being thrown into deep space with no oxygen. Mathematics wasn't just numbers here, it was a complex web of quantum constructs that folded dimensions. Physics operated on scales beyond human understanding, where entire realities were calculated in microseconds. Even history was a challenge, spanning civilizations so old that Earth's recorded past was barely a footnote. Eli spent sleepless nights trying to understand equations that his peers solved in seconds. While the Orcs used their crystalline minds to process data at light speed and the Talnax shared knowledge through neural linking, Eli was stuck scribbling notes in an old-fashioned notebook, trying desperately to keep up. And his classmates noticed. "Your species still uses linear processing," a core student had asked him once, his many eyes blinking in confusion. "How do you function at all?" Others weren't as polite. "Why waste resources on a species so behind?" one of the Zeltrax had muttered to a friend, not even bothering to lower his voice. "Maybe he's a pet project," another had sneered. "A study in failure." Eli forced himself to ignore the whispers, but each one was another crack in his confidence. Still, he didn't give up. Then came the test that would change everything. Eli sat at his desk in the vast, gravity-neutral examination hall, staring at the complex quantum calculus problem projected in front of him. It was a monster of an equation, something that should have taken years of study to even approach. The other students were already deep in their work, their fingers and tentacles dancing across floating holographic interfaces, minds seamlessly connected to databases of knowledge. Eli's mind, however, was blank. His heart pounded. Panic clawed at his throat. He had no idea where to begin. He had studied. He had prepared. But this was beyond anything he had expected. His first major test, and he was about to fail spectacularly. Then a thought struck him. He wasn't like them. He never had been. Humans weren't built for raw calculation, but they were built for something else: instinct, improvisation, and the ability to see solutions where none seemed to exist. Eli took a shaky breath. Instead of trying to brute force the equation the way his peers did, he approached it like a puzzle. He broke it down, looking for patterns, shortcuts, anything that could give him an edge. He thought back to Earth, how humans had once been outmatched by nature, by stronger predators, by more powerful enemies. Yet they had survived. Not because they were the biggest, fastest, or strongest, but because they adapted. A spark lit in his mind. He saw a way forward. A trick that wasn't in any textbook. A completely unconventional approach that no alien would think to use. It wasn't perfect, but it was possible. He worked quickly, his fingers flying across the interface, his brain connecting ideas in a way no logic-driven species ever would. And then, the problem was solved. Silence filled his mind. Had he actually done it? His heart hammered in his chest as he looked around. The other students were still working, their complex computations unfolding like clockwork. But his test had already been submitted. He braced himself for the backlash. This was either the greatest moment of his life, or the biggest mistake he'd ever made. The examination hall at Zenithar Academy was a grand, circular chamber with towering holographic displays filled with equations that pulsed in eerie blue light. Students from various species sat at their designated stations, their multi-fingered appendages or telepathic minds swiftly manipulating complex equations. Eli Carter, the lone human in the room, clenched his fists as he stared at the test in front of him. The problem was beyond anything he had studied, requiring a level of computational speed and abstract reasoning that his human mind simply wasn't built for. The Orcs, with their crystalline neural structures, processed numbers with cold efficiency. The Talnaks, natural telepaths, worked in synchrony, sharing thoughts instantly. Even the Zeltrax, the logic-driven species, had no difficulty following the rigid mathematical pathways needed to solve the problem. Eli, however, was drowning. He tapped his fingers against the desk. Think, Eli. Think. He had never been the smartest student, nor the strongest, but humans had one thing that set them apart: improvisation. Instead of approaching the problem in the structured way the aliens did, he took a different path. He scanned the equations and noticed a pattern. The problem was designed with an assumption in mind, that the solver would follow a linear, logical progression. But humans didn't always think in straight lines. They found shortcuts, used trial and error, and relied on intuition when pure logic failed. Eli took a deep breath and broke the problem apart in a way no one else had. Instead of solving it line by line, he worked backward, looking for inconsistencies, gaps in the logic that could be exploited. Time ticked down. The students around him were finishing, their answers glowing green as the system validated their solutions. Eli could feel the weight of a dozen alien eyes on him, waiting for him to fail. Then, a breakthrough. Eli saw a way to simplify the entire problem into a single intuitive step. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't how the problem was meant to be solved. But it worked. With seconds left, he entered his final answer and pressed submit. A pause. Then, the screen lit up green. Eli's heart pounded. He had done it. He had beaten a test designed for minds far more advanced than his own. But before he could celebrate, the murmurs began. Across the hall, alien students and professors stared at his answer in disbelief. The logic-driven Zeltrax instructor furrowed his brow, scanning Eli's unconventional solution. "This is impossible," the professor muttered. "No species has ever answered the problem in this manner." Eli could already see it in their eyes. They didn't understand how he had done it. And soon enough, the accusations would come. Eli sat rigidly in the center of the Zenithar Academy Council chamber, his heart pounding. The room was vast, with towering pillars of shimmering energy that pulsed with an eerie blue glow. Around him, the school council, a collection of the most esteemed alien scholars and administrators, stared him down with cold, analytical eyes. At the head of the council sat Professor Valles, a Zeltraxian with a body composed of sleek, metallic plates and piercing yellow eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. His species prided itself on absolute logic, and right now, his expression was one of deep suspicion. "You will explain yourself, human," Professor Valles intoned, his voice smooth but laced with quiet menace. Eli swallowed hard. "Explain what, exactly?" Vales's eyes narrowed. With a flick of his hand, a holographic projection of Eli's exam results appeared above the chamber. The solution, his solution, was displayed in radiant blue symbols, rotating slowly for the entire council to see. "This answer is unlike anything we have ever seen," Valles said. "It does not follow the established methodologies. It circumvents the logical structure of the problem entirely. Such a solution should not be possible." A murmur ran through the council. Some of the members, particularly the more rigid species like the Zeltrax, looked outright offended. One of them, a reptilian Vornak with dark, gleaming scales, leaned forward. "There is only one possible explanation," he hissed. "You cheated." Eli's jaw tightened. "That's not true. I just thought differently." "Thought differently?" Valles scoffed. "We have taught this course for over 300 galactic cycles. Not once has any species, not even the most intelligent among us, produced a solution that defies the fundamental principles of quantum calculus." Another council member, a massive Orc with a crystalline exoskeleton, let out a low hum. "We detected no unauthorized computational devices. No signals of outside assistance." "Then he must have stolen the answer in some other way," the Vornak sneered. "Perhaps he had prior knowledge of the question." Eli clenched his fists. "I didn't steal anything. I solved the problem on my own." "Then explain how," Valles said, his glowing eyes narrowing. Eli hesitated. How could he explain it? His solution wasn't the product of brute force calculation or rigorous memorization. It was instinctive, a combination of pattern recognition, intuition, and a little bit of desperation-fueled creativity. He had looked at the problem like a puzzle, not an equation. But to these aliens, that didn't make sense. Their minds were built on rigid structures, bound by rules and traditions. To them, Eli's approach was not just unusual, it was impossible. "You see," the Vornak sneered. "He cannot even articulate how he arrived at his answer." Eli felt frustration bubbling inside him. Why couldn't they just accept that humans thought differently? Professor Valles straightened. "Until we can verify the legitimacy of your methods, you are to be suspended from the academy. Effective immediately." Eli's stomach dropped. "You're suspending me? For what? For thinking differently?" "This is not about thinking differently," Valles said coldly. "This is about maintaining the integrity of Zenithar Academy. If you cannot prove that your methods are valid, you have no place here." Eli opened his mouth to argue, but the decision had already been made. Two robotic sentinels stepped forward, their metal bodies gleaming as they extended their arms toward him. "You will be escorted from the premises," one of them droned. Eli looked around, hoping for some kind of support, but the other students just watched in silence. Some looked curious. Others looked smug. But none of them spoke up for him. As the sentinels led him out of the chamber, Eli felt a sinking realization settle over him. He had done something incredible, but no one was ready to believe it. Yet. Eli's boots echoed against the polished floors as the robotic sentinels escorted him through the halls of Zenithar Academy. The eyes of students and instructors followed him, some whispering, others simply watching with detached curiosity. He kept his expression neutral, but inside, his frustration burned. Suspended? For solving a problem too well? The sentinels stopped at the academy's outer gates. One of them, a dull gray machine with glowing red optics, turned to face him. "You are hereby suspended pending investigation. You may not re-enter Zenithar Academy without express permission." A low hiss sounded as the force field barrier activated, sealing him outside. Eli exhaled slowly. The icy winds of Nearaxis, the Academy's host planet, whipped at his uniform, but he barely felt it. His mind was already racing. If they wouldn't believe him, he had to make them. But how? As he turned to leave, a deep voice interrupted him. You are either a liar, or the most dangerous human I have ever met. Eli turned sharply. Standing in the shadows near the Academy gates was a towering figure, a Drekker. His species was infamous across the galaxy for its warlike nature, its honor-bound traditions, and its absolute disdain for weakness. This particular Drekker was larger than most, easily 7 feet tall, clad in reinforced battle armor even in an academic setting. His reptilian face was lined with deep scars, and his piercing gold eyes locked onto Eli with unsettling intensity. Eli recognized him immediately. Commander Ralvek. Not just an instructor, but a military strategist who lectured at Zenithar Academy. Eli swallowed. I'm not a liar. Ralvek tilted his head, studying him. So you say. The Drekker took a slow, deliberate step forward, the weight of his presence alone enough to make most beings uneasy. Your solution to the exam, Ralvek continued, his voice like grinding stone, was unorthodox. That alone is not a crime. But the way you arrived at it, he paused. That terrifies them. Eli blinked. Terrifies? Ralvek let out a low, rumbling chuckle. Oh, you are naive. You do not yet understand the galaxy you live in. The Drekker folded his arms. Every species at Zenithar Academy follows the same patterns of thinking. The same methods. The same constraints. But you, he narrowed his eyes. You shattered those constraints. You did not just solve the equation, you saw through it. And that is what makes you dangerous. Eli frowned. Dangerous how? I just thought differently. Ralvek's golden eyes gleamed. Exactly. And that is why the Council wants you gone. The galaxy does not reward those who break the rules of thought. It fears them. Eli clenched his fists. So what do I do? Just accept being expelled for being too good at math? Ralvek was silent for a moment. Then, a slow, knowing grin spread across his face. No, he said. You challenge them. Eli stiffened. Challenge? Ralvek leaned down, his voice dropping to a growl. The only way to prove your worth, is to fight for it. Eli's heart pounded. Fight how? Ralvek's grin widened. The Grand Scholar's Gauntlet, he said. An ancient test of intellect and strategy. A challenge no human has ever attempted, and no student has completed in over 50 cycles. Eli hesitated. And if I win? Ralvek's eyes gleamed with something between amusement and respect. If you win, the Council will have no choice but to acknowledge your genius. And you will change the very foundation of Zenithar Academy. Eli's pulse quickened. This wasn't just about proving he hadn't cheated. This was about proving that humanity was more than what the galaxy expected. He exhaled slowly, then met Ralvek's gaze. I'm in. Eli stood in the central chamber of the Zenithar Academy, his gaze locked on the enormous holodisplay that loomed above the assembled crowd. It was official. His challenge had been accepted. The Grand Scholar's Gauntlet, an ancient test of intellect, logic, and strategy, had not been completed in over 50 cycles. It was designed to be nearly impossible, a trial meant to humble even the most brilliant minds. Failure was expected. Eli intended to win. The amphitheater surrounding him buzzed with a mixture of excitement and skepticism. Students from every species at the Academy had gathered to witness the spectacle. Some whispered that Eli was a fool, that a mere human could never surpass the best minds in the galaxy. Others, like Ralvek, watched in silent amusement, waiting to see if Eli could truly defy expectations. At the center of the chamber, 3 elder scholars, high-ranking members of the academic council, stood on a raised platform. The middle one, a long-limbed Velari, leaned forward, her translucent skin shimmering under the artificial lights. "You understand the consequences of failure?" she asked, her voice both melodic and sharp. Eli nodded. "I do." The Velari's lips curled. "Then let the gauntlet begin." A pulse of blue light shot out from the center of the chamber, and the room shifted. The first trial had begun. Trial 1, the prisoner's paradox. The lights dimmed. A deep mechanical voice echoed through the chamber. 3 prisoners. 1 escape pod. You may ask them only one question to determine who is telling the truth. Choose wisely, failure means destruction. A holographic simulation flickered to life before Eli, showing 3 alien prisoners. One was a Scarthul, a towering, armored species known for deception. The second, a Traylon, had a brain-like structure for a head, renowned for logical trickery. The third was a human, looking desperate and terrified. The problem was a classic logic puzzle, but with alien variables. Eli's mind raced. The trick to these puzzles was simple: force the liars to contradict themselves. He stepped forward. "I have one question, right?" The scholars nodded. Eli smirked. "All right." He turned to the Traylon. "If I were to ask one of the others which escape pod is the right one, which would they point to?" The Traylon hesitated. Bingo. This was the famous two-doors riddle from ancient human philosophy. A liar will always lie, and an honest being forced to relay a liar's answer would also lie. Eli turned and chose the opposite of what the Traylon indicated. The chamber flashed green. Trial 1, passed. Murmurs spread through the crowd. No one had ever solved the first challenge in less than 30 seconds. But Eli wasn't done yet. Trial 2, the unbeatable opponent. The chamber shifted again. A massive robotic figure emerged from the floor, its armor gleaming under the artificial lights. Defeat your opponent in combat. Physical attacks are useless. Eli stared at the towering machine. The other students murmured, this was where most challengers failed. The Drekker beside Ralvek scoffed. A human can't defeat that. Ralvek, however, smirked. He doesn't need to fight. Eli narrowed his eyes. If physical attacks were useless, then this wasn't a combat test, it was a strategic puzzle. His mind worked through the possibilities. The machine was likely automated, following predictable patterns. If he could manipulate those patterns, then he had already won. The moment the robot stepped forward to attack, Eli did nothing. He simply sidestepped, and the machine's massive fist slammed into the reinforced floor. The crowd gasped. The machine recalibrated, adjusting to Eli's evasions. But Eli had already figured it out. The more it missed, the more power it put into its attacks. And that meant it was overloading its own core. After 5 dodges, the machine's circuits flashed red. System failure. The robot collapsed. The chamber flashed green again. Trial 2, passed. The amphitheater was no longer whispering. They were staring. Trial 3, the impossible equation. The final trial. A wall of symbols appeared before Eli. Numbers, alien script, and equations so complex they seemed nonsensical. Solve the unsolvable. This was the trial no one had ever passed. The equations were deliberately paradoxical, numbers that couldn't exist, symbols that defied logic. Eli exhaled slowly. Then, he did what no other student had ever dared to do. He stepped back. And refused to solve it. The council members gasped. The crowd tensed. The Velari scholar narrowed her eyes. You are forfeiting? Eli smirked. No. He pointed to the screen. This is not a solvable equation. It's designed to trap anyone who tries to make sense of it. The real answer is realizing it's a trick. The chamber went silent. Then, green light flooded the room. Trial 3 passed. For the first time in 50 cycles, someone had beaten the gauntlet. The moment that changed everything. The silence stretched. Then, from the council's platform, the Velari scholar stood, her shimmering skin darkening in shock. The headmaster himself stepped forward. This has never happened. Ralvek, still standing in the crowd, laughed. A deep, satisfied sound. The Drekker beside him hissed, "This is impossible." Ralvek grinned. "No. This is human ingenuity." The scholars whispered among themselves. The rules were clear, whoever passed the gauntlet had their place in the academy secured. Eli had not only passed. He had done the impossible. The Velari turned back to him. "You have forced us to acknowledge your skill." Eli smirked. "So am I reinstated?" The council hesitated. Then, the headmaster nodded. "More than that," he said. "From this moment forward, humanity is recognized as one of the most formidable minds in the galaxy." The chamber erupted into stunned murmurs. Eli had done more than just prove his innocence. He had changed everything. A stunned silence hung over the amphitheater. Eli had done the impossible. He had beaten the Grand Scholar's gauntlet, a test so difficult that even the greatest minds in the galaxy had failed for over 50 cycles. The challenge was meant to be a spectacle of humility, a way to remind students that some barriers were simply unbreakable. But Eli had broken it. The Velari scholar, her luminous skin still flickering in disbelief, turned to the council. "This cannot be ignored." The headmaster, a towering Zenithar, folded his many arms and nodded gravely. "The results are undeniable." A murmur swept through the crowd. Some students gaped in awe. Others scowled in resentment. Eli felt their stares. Some of them had spent their entire lives believing humans were inferior, a primitive species barely worthy of being in the academy. And now? He had rewritten the hierarchy in less than an hour. Ralvek's satisfaction. Up in the stands, Ralvek let out a low chuckle. The Drekker beside him, his ridged brow furrowed in confusion, hissed, "How can you be amused? A human just humiliated the entire academy." Ralvek grinned, his sharp teeth glinting. That wasn't humiliation. His eyes gleamed with something deeper, something dangerous. That was a demonstration. The Drekker scoffed. Of what? Ralvek leaned forward, watching as the council deliberated. That humans are not to be underestimated. A division among the scholars. The scholars whispered among themselves, debating what to do next. "This is unprecedented," one murmured. "Never has an outsider." "Not just an outsider," another cut in, her voice tense. "A human." The Velari scholar, still struggling to process what had happened, turned to Eli. "Your academic status was already revoked. Even if you have proven your intelligence, the decision was made." A murmur of agreement rippled through the council. Some of them wanted a reason to deny Eli's reinstatement. Eli folded his arms, his face unreadable. "So you're saying the gauntlet means nothing?" The Velari hesitated. The challenge had been a sacred test for centuries. To claim it no longer mattered after he passed would expose the academy as fraudulent, willing to bend the rules when it suited them. The headmaster sighed heavily. "The challenge stands." He turned to Eli. "Your expulsion is hereby overturned. You are reinstated as a student of Zenithar Academy, effective immediately." Eli exhaled, keeping his face calm, but inside, he had won. The ripple effect. The crowd erupted into a storm of mixed reactions. Some students cheered, recognizing the historical moment for what it was. Others whispered angrily, their prejudices too deeply rooted to accept a human success. And then there were the professors, some of whom looked deeply unsettled. Eli had not just beaten the gauntlet. He had shattered a barrier. He had forced the entire academic elite to acknowledge that humans, a species so often dismissed, could stand among the greatest minds in the galaxy. And that meant everything had changed. Ralvek smirked, watching the scholars squirm. "This is only the beginning," he muttered under his breath. "A new target." As Eli stepped forward, standing tall in front of the entire assembly, he caught sight of a group of robed figures near the edge of the chamber. They were not students. They were members of the Interspecies Academic Council, a powerful governing body that controlled the flow of knowledge across the stars. And they were watching him very, very closely. One of them, a tall figure cloaked in blue, whispered something to a companion. Eli could feel it. He wasn't just a student anymore. He was a threat. And someone, somewhere, would be looking for a way to eliminate that threat. But Eli just smirked. Let them try. The academy halls buzzed with energy. Whispers followed Eli wherever he went, rippling through the student body like an electric current. Some gazes were filled with admiration, others with thinly veiled hostility. Eli had done the impossible, but victory always had a price. And he was starting to feel its weight. A chilling warning. Eli sat alone in the academy's central plaza, the artificial sunlight casting a warm glow over the polished stone. He sipped on a nutrient drink, trying to ignore the stares from passing students. "You've made quite a mess, human." Eli didn't flinch. He knew that voice. Ralvek slid onto the bench across from him, his reptilian grin revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. His golden eyes gleamed with amusement, and something else. "You shattered a centuries-old record," Ralvek continued, tapping his claws on the table. "Humiliated the elites. Forced them to acknowledge what they've been trying to deny." He leaned in slightly. "And now, you're a problem." Eli smirked. "I've been a problem since I got here." Ralvek chuckled. "Perhaps. But now, you're a threat." The words carried an unsettling weight. Eli had suspected as much. The moment he saw those robed figures watching him from the amphitheater, he knew this wasn't over. "What do you know?" Eli asked. Ralvek's grin faded. "There are forces beyond this academy that don't like disruptions." "The Interspecies Academic Council?" He scoffed. "They don't want change. They want control. And you, human, are something they cannot control." Eli remained silent. "They'll come for you," Ralvek said. "Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And when they do, they won't play fair." Eli exhaled, setting his drink down. "Let them come." Ralvek studied him for a moment, then let out a deep, rumbling laugh. "You really are something else." He stood. "Keep your head on a swivel, human." And then he was gone. Shadows in the hall. That night, as Eli walked back to his dorm, the halls felt different. Quieter. Colder. He rounded a corner, and stopped. A figure stood at the end of the corridor, draped in a deep blue robe, their face obscured beneath a hood. Eli's muscles tensed. The figure didn't move. Didn't speak. Then, without a word, they turned and disappeared down a side passage. Eli hesitated only a moment before following. He wasn't about to let this go. He stepped into the passageway, only to find himself in a vast, empty chamber, one he had never seen before. The walls pulsed with faint energy, and the air felt heavy. A whisper echoed through the space. "Eli Carter." He turned sharply. Another figure, cloaked in red, stepped forward from the shadows. Unlike the blue-robed figure, This one revealed their face, a pale-skinned being with sharp, angular features and piercing violet eyes. "You are reckless," the figure said, their voice smooth and controlled. "And that makes you dangerous." Eli folded his arms. "If you wanted to talk about my study habits, you could have just sent a message." The figure's lips twitched in the barest hint of amusement. "This academy was never meant for you," they continued. "You were allowed to enroll because we believed your species would fail, quietly. That humans would recognize their place in the grand design and fade into obscurity." The figure took a step closer. "But you? You've disrupted that design." Eli stared them down. "If you think I'm going to apologize for proving myself, you're wasting your time." The figure tilted their head slightly. "We do not want an apology." The room grew darker. The air thicker. "We want you gone." Eli's instincts screamed at him, "Move." He jumped back just as the figure raised a hand, releasing a pulse of energy that ripped through the space where he had just stood. A test. A warning. Or a promise. Eli clenched his fists. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one.